All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kathryn. I'm with the Snohomish Conservation District. Welcome to the Country Living Expo's class on Living with Beavers with Elyssa Kerr. I'll be introducing her in just a moment. I just wanted to talk you through a little bit about the platform today. You've probably been familiar with this if you've attended other classes, but Elyssa will be taking questions throughout the presentation at various points. So please put your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, or you may raise your hand and I'll keep a log of who's raising their hand, and then you can ask your question at that time. Please keep your audio lines muted unless we unmute you. And just as a reminder, we are recording this class, so you have access to it afterwards. The Snohomish Conservation District, for those of you who don't know, we are a state agency, non-regulatory state agency that provides free technical and financial assistance to land managers in Snohomish County and on Camano Island. So if you own property, or if you have a good relationship with the person who owns property to do stewardship activities, we are happy to help you out. We work with rural and urban residents to improve habitat, soil health, productivity, resiliency, and water quality through best management practices. Some of those best management practices are going to be discussed today regarding how to, store water with beavers on your land. In addition to workshops like this and technical assistance directly with you, we also provide many different types of classes throughout the year. Couple of them that are coming up soon. On February 3rd, we're having an online discussion about trees and how practices with trees, particularly in an agricultural setting, can help mitigate climate change. So please sign up, check our events page on our website. If you're interested in that online discussion, we'd love to have you. And then our native plant sale is coming up. The pre-orders close. In other words, we're not taking any more pre-orders after February 10th. Elyssa is our plant sale manager. And so if you have questions about that, please save them for the end, and we can answer them perhaps during the week or something like that, unless there's extra time at the end. But we do have some trees still available, so please get your orders in soon. This class is being held partially supported by, I apologize, by the Department of Ecology and the Puget Sound Partnership through a grant. So we want to gratefully express our gratitude to the Department of Ecology and the Puget Sound Partnership for providing funding to allow this class to be provided as part of the grant activities. And a huge thanks to the Washington State University Extension, Livestock Master Foundation, WSU Skagit and Snohomish County Extension Livestock Advisor Program, and the Cattlemen's Association for scrambling to hold the Country Living Expo in the time when we cannot get together in person. So hopefully next year we'll all be in person again. All right, with that, I will turn this over to Elyssa. Let me introduce you here first real quick. Elyssa runs our Living with Beavers program. She has many years experience helping find ways to keep beavers on the land where they can provide so many different benefits, which she'll describe today, while also minimizing damage and flooding. So with that, thank you very much, Elyssa. We're happy to have you.
Thanks, Kathryn. I'm gonna just share my screen. Okay, here we are. Slideshow. Okay, so as Kathryn mentioned, we'll pause throughout for questions. So feel free to throw those questions in the chat box throughout, and then we'll pause and get a chance to look at those and answer them. So today, we're talking about beavers. As Kathryn mentioned, I run our Living with Beavers program, among other duties, such as running the native plant sale. And so this is kind of one of my favorite topics to cover. I also work part-time as the executive director of Beavers Northwest. So I'm really ingrained in the beaver world in the area and happy to answer all the questions you have. Typically, I do a lot of work out in the field, helping to implement practices to mitigate beaver flooding. So this is me, you know, elbow deep and waist deep in a beaver pond and doing that work. But of course, now here we are at home. I do have a cat who may make an appearance. I apologize in advance for any disruption he causes, but he really loves to be around people. So he's very curious about beavers too, I guess. I want to just run briefly through our agenda for this talk. We're going to talk a lot about who beavers are and kind of what they're doing. So, you know, what are these big rodents? What are these dams that they're building? Why are they doing all of that? And then we're going to talk about why you should care. You know, beavers aren't just a big scary rodent. There's a lot of benefits to beavers in our area. And then last but not least, we'll talk a little bit about how Snohomish Conservation District fits in and how we can provide assistance in beaver conflict areas. So I wanted to start us off with a poll. So Kathryn's going to start a poll for us. I really just want to get a gauge on why everyone's tuning in to the talk, so that I can kind of tailor as we talk and spend more time on those things that you're interested in. So number one, just interested in if you've ever seen a beaver, and then also interested in why you're here today and what drew you to this class in the Country Living Expo.
Okay, answers are coming in.
Great.
And almost there, got almost everybody. It's looking like most everyone is tuning in today to learn more about beavers, and there are a few who are learning how to manage beavers on their property. And it looks like about 57% have them on their property or nearby, and others have seen them while recreating. There are a couple who have not seen them before. And then there's another person who tuned in today for another reason, and I haven't seen that in the chat yet, but looks like, yeah, there's some great interest in beavers and in general.
Great, that's what I like to hear. So we're here for everything, learning about beavers and learning about how to manage them. That's perfect. Oh, great, thanks for sharing the results, Kathryn. Great, okay, so we'll keep moving on here, and again, answer those questions, throw them in the chat box, and we'll have time to answer them as we go. So here is our beaver, the star of the show today. And the first thing I want to impress upon everybody is that beavers are large. So it sounds like most of you have seen beavers, some of you haven't, but it's important to remember, I think a lot of people get this idea in their head that beavers are just a little water rat, you know, and they're small, they're doing, you know, their thing as a little rodent, but beavers are really big. So they, as adults, can average between 25 and 70 pounds. I've heard of the urban legend of a record beaver that weighed more than 120 pounds that was found up in Canada. So urban legend, but still possible. So beavers are gigantic. And I think that's really important to think about these big impacts that they have on our ecosystems because they are a big rodent. And the other thing to think about here is that beavers are pretty ubiquitous across North America. So this species, there's only 2 species of beavers in the world. And today we're talking about the North American beaver, which lives pretty much all across the US and Canada. They live pretty much anywhere where there is water and woody vegetation. So you can think about that in this map here of distribution. Beavers, the dark green is where you could find beavers pretty regularly. So they're not really appearing up in the frozen Arctic tundra because we don't have a lot of water availability there or woody vegetation. And then same as you get down into the deserts in Mexico. And of course, this isn't a perfect map. Beavers don't just follow political lines. There are some beavers that live down in Mexico, but much less. And in those drier, more desert climates, we're not seeing beavers thriving. So I also want to jump into some doppelgangers that you might see out and about, especially if you live near a wetland or an area where you do have beavers, or if you're out recreating along our waterways in Washington, these are some of the other players that you might see out and about and mistake for a beaver. So reminder, beavers are large, 25 to 70 pounds. One of the ones that we most often confuse beavers with is Nutria. And Nutria are a little bit smaller than beavers, and they're a non-native species and often considered invasive in our area. Nutria are from South America, were brought up to North America for their fur. They were raised in fur farms and then eventually, released, escaped, whatever happens with those invasive species, and have since spread. And they are around in Washington for sure. So Nutria are much more diggers than beavers. They'll dig into banks and sides of streams, and so they cause a lot more erosion issues than beavers, which is one of the reasons that they are kind of not a favored species in our area. Some key differences between Nutria and beaver. Of course, size is one that I mentioned, but a really big Nutria could look like a really small beaver. But their tail is very different. Obviously, they have this kind of rat-like tail compared to our beaver's big, flat, paddle-like tail. And then their face structure is a little bit different. You'll notice their noses, to me, look a little more pig-like, whereas a beaver's nose looks a little more dog-like. And then their whiskers are very bright, conspicuous, white, and long, whereas beavers have really short, dark, inconspicuous whiskers. So you really got to get up close and personal with a Nutria to tell that their whiskers are the defining factor. But certainly for pictures, it's an easy way to tell. Of course, it is tough when you're seeing just a semi-aquatic rodent. All you see is their little brown head floating in the water as they're swimming along. So that can be a tough feature. And none of these animals, unfortunately, swim with their tails like sticking straight up out of the water. So you really got to wait until they dive to see what kind of tail they've got. Another critter that you might see swimming along that looks a lot like a beaver would be a muskrat. I've been mistaken on several occasions when I've seen muskrats swimming around and I go, oh my gosh, it's a baby beaver. And then it dives and you see its little rat-like tail, which is the key difference, again, between beavers and muskrats. Besides size. So muskrats are very much smaller than beavers, but a small muskrat could look like a baby beaver. So that rat-like tail versus our paddle-like tail is really the key indicator. But they do occupy similar habitats. So you might see a muskrat swimming in a beaver pond. Even if you know there are beavers there, you could be looking at a muskrat. Another one that is, just one of our semi-aquatic mammals around here, not a rodent, but semi-aquatic mammal, is a river otter. And river otters can be seen swimming, again, in the same habitats as beavers in these wetland riparian areas. But river otters have this long, skinny body, kind of more like a wiener dog than, beavers are this kind of big, bulky thing. And then they also have a long rudder-like tail. So it's less rat-like than the muskrat or the Nutria. It's very long and much stronger and more muscular. And river otters are kind of, they jump all around and they swim around and are jumping and diving and things like that, whereas all these other creatures spend a lot more time just gently, slowly swimming. The last one I just want to mention, because some folks always ask about mountain beavers, and they're just kind of a funky, weird outlier in this whole thing. They are rodents like the muskrat, beaver, and Nutria, but they're not very closely related to beavers, and they're not necessarily always around waterways. So beavers, muskrats, Nutria, you'll always see them living near waterways. They are semi-aquatic rodents. A mountain beaver could be living on a hillside. They might be near water, but not always. And they are just like this funky, weird little creature that we have in our area. I actually just spotted one for the first time ever last weekend and had a great time watching it gathering English ivy and bringing it into its little burrows. And they're very funky, about 1 to 2 pounds, so much smaller, again, than beavers and much of the other animals we're looking at here. So those are our doppelgangers, some identifying features of our beaver compared to some of the other friends that you might see out and about. But really, we want to talk about beavers today. So some of the eating habits of beavers, they're considered choosy generalist herbivores, which means that they are herbivores, so they're vegetarians. They mostly eat plant matter. They're generalists, which means they'll eat just about anything that they can find, but they're choosy because they have specific species that they prefer over others. So they tend to like certain species more. They will eat herbaceous vegetation and aquatic vegetation like lilies, spatter dock, things like that. You see this one chewing on, you know, some floating leaves. And then they, of course, also eat trees and shrubs. And really, when they're eating these things, they're mostly eating the bark and the cambium. And the cambium is that layer just underneath the bark where it's got all those tasty sugars. It's really the growing part of the wood. So they are chewing those. You'll see these sticks that are denuded. I've got a few here behind me. So these sticks that have just been all the bark chewed off of them, which is a good indication that a beaver was having a snack while they were also chewing on that tree. The good news here too that I like to point out is some of the species, the tree species that beavers do prefer in their choosy nature, is they do prefer willows and cottonwoods. And willows and cottonwoods have an amazing tendency to re-sprout once they are chewed. So you'll notice this tree, this photo here on the left is of a tree that was chewed down, a pretty young tree, but then it re-sprouted after it was chewed, and now it's got 20 new shoots coming up. And so certainly they're kind of changing the habit of these tree species. You know, a willow could grow a little bit straighter and taller, but if it gets chewed down, it's going to have this shrubby growth pattern where it's going to have, you know, more branches coming off of the base and be a little shrubbier, a little shorter, not as straight and tall, but certainly still really great habitat for lots of wildlife. So that's kind of a good message I like to share. I think a lot of folks get really concerned when trees start getting chewed down. And it can be really scary and can be detrimental, but there are a lot of species that respond well to that. So that's a good positive note. I also, at this point, you know, in a talk, if we were in person together, I would start passing around some of these sticks, passing around a beaver skull for you to take a look at. But I want to point out some of the features that make beavers really great at chewing down these trees. Namely, their teeth are very, very specifically built for this kind of work. So you'll notice that their teeth have I have another photo here of a smiling beaver for you. So their front teeth have a orangey layer on the front, and that's a tooth layer that's actually reinforced with iron. And then the layer behind is white. And so what happens is those very strong reinforced teeth are able to chew through these logs, but then they're also self-sharpening because the back of the teeth wears away more quickly than the front. So then you've got this kind of sharpening nature as they're chewing, and their teeth continue to grow throughout their lifetime. So they are kind of wearing down their teeth as they go, but they continue to grow. And some folks have even mentioned that, you know, their teeth continue to grow throughout their lifetime, which can lead to, if they are not chewing, that can lead to issues for them because their teeth will grow so long that it makes it hard for them to eat. You'll also notice in this photo of the skull at the top that their front teeth are well removed from their back teeth. Their back teeth are more used for the chewing of those tree species as they're grinding them up to be digested, whereas the front is for that chipping away at the trees. And that large space between the front teeth and the back teeth is very interesting because when beavers have skin and musculature on their skull, there is a second set of lips that is right there in that space between the front and the back teeth. And that it allows them to kind of carry sticks in their front teeth, but close that second pair of lips so they're not swallowing water as they're swimming under carrying a stick. So kind of a unique adaptation that beavers have for living in this semi-aquatic lifestyle. Okay, and this is just kind of all these different sticks are just to show kind of the different aging, right? A beaver tree that has been chewed down will age in like this upper right photo. You might see a really old chewed tree versus a really freshly chewed tree with wood chips down here on the right that you can really identify. Okay, and then of course, beavers, besides chewing down trees, are most well known for their dam building. So I've got a couple different photos of beaver dams here to kind of show the variety in their building strategies. So the upper left photo shows a dam that's mostly built out of mud and muck. And the lower dam is kind of something that we more traditionally think of as a beaver dam with lots of sticks, packed in with mud. Beavers will use any material that is available to them, and so that could include stones or rocks. It could include reed canary grass and reed canary grass root balls, like in the upper right photo. It could include trash if you're in an urban environment or somewhere where a lot of trash has been dumped. I had a question from a student a couple months ago who asked me if beavers would build their dam out of toothbrushes if a toothbrush delivery truck fell into the river. And I said, probably, because they're just really utilizing what they've got around them. So that's kind of the main thing, is that you'll see these different dams and you're like, well, I'm not sure if that's a beaver dam. But really, if it looks like it's naturally built out of natural materials or toothbrushes that have fallen into a stream, then it's likely a beaver dam, because there's not really many creatures that'll do this same kind of thing. So these are kind of the variety of dams. And the primary reason that beavers build dams like this is to create more space for themselves. They're very big and awkward on land, and could be a really tasty treat for a big predator. And so the more space that they have where they can swim, where they're much sleeker and faster, and can move a lot better, then the happier they are. So by damming up these areas, they create these really big ponds, back up that water. It allows them to access more vegetation, as they've got this wider perimeter of the pond for them to go up into areas and access all that vegetation around the pond. And their preferred species that they like to eat, like willows and cottonwoods, really like that wet habitat. So they're kind of encouraging growth of some of these species that they prefer to eat, and potentially flooding out other species that they don't love as much. And then, of course, as they're building these dams, another main purpose is to find a place to live. So not only are they creating an area to access more food, but they're creating a pond that they can live in. And so often you'll see a dam, and then in the pond that's created by that dam, beavers may have a lodge, which is where they are living. So beaver lodges all kind of have this similar form, where it just looks like a big pile of sticks. They're sometimes, like in the upper left photo, sometimes they're in the middle of a pond, or the lower photo on the bottom right. Sometimes they're up against a bank or a shore or an island, and they'll do kind of a combination where they dig into the ground, do a little bank den, and then pile sticks on top of it. Some beavers don't really even build lodges. Around here, we do see cases where beavers just have a bank lodge or a bank den, where they burrow into the side of a river channel, and that's where they're living. So if you see all these other signs of beavers, if you see a dam and you see these 2 trees, but you can't find a lodge, that doesn't necessarily mean that those beavers aren't there. It just means they didn't choose to build a lodge. So lodges are really unique, and they're also really big. So this photo up in the upper right shows 3 folks standing on top of a lodge. And that's just to share with you that, once again, we talk about how beavers are huge and they're living in these structures. So the structures have to be really huge as well. And these lodges typically have an underwater entrance, and then inside is a nice dry chamber for the beavers to rest, sleep, eat, raise their young, and all of that. So those underwater entrances are meant to help keep predators out of their lodge. Easier for beavers to access, more difficult for predators to get in. And then this is a really great photo. There was a live stream video for a while in 2019 where some folks up in the Mendenhall area stuck a camera into a beaver lodge and actually just had it filming all the time, and you could tune in and see the beavers. Beavers are nocturnal, so typically if I tuned in during the day, I would just see this cute little cuddle puddle of beavers sitting in their lodge. And beavers are familial, so they do live in colonies with their family. Typically, beavers will find a mate, and then mom and dad will have 1 to 3 kits each year, and those kits will stay with them until they're 2 years old. So you could have a family of beavers that's upwards of 6 or 7 beavers all living together, helping to maintain the lodge, helping to maintain the dam, helping to raise the young. So those beaver kits do stay with family for 2 years. And then the 2-year-olds go off on their own. They're kind of like teenage beavers finding their way in the world, trying to figure it out. So they're the ones that disperse, and sometimes we'll build dams in really inopportune places that aren't good for you and aren't good for the beaver. So sometimes they'll figure that out and move on, which is a pretty interesting facet. Okay, so I'm going to pause. That's kind of the end of our beaver biology, beaver what's going on with beavers, who are they, talk. Next, we'll talk a little bit about beaver benefits. So feel free to type more questions in the chat, and I can answer that, and we'll move on to benefits shortly.
We don't have any questions at this point.
Great. Well,
Yep,
then we'll keep moving.
oh, wait a minute. Alert, alert. Do they stay in an area even after very fast river flow? Oh, great question.
Even after very fast flow, sure. So like if we get a big storm event and water blows out their dam, that happens quite occasionally on our Western Washington rivers and streams. So beavers will they try to build in spots that they know will work well. So if a dam gets blown out over and over and over again, they'll probably leave. But if a dam gets blown out once, if they've been there already for a long time, they've already got an established lodge or established bank den, they will stay and continue to try and improve their dam. So what we have seen in the past is these really large dams that get huge, and then for some reason or another, maybe a tree falls on their dam, or we get a big storm event and it just breaks apart. The pond will be dewatered. It'll be like, wow, this is no longer good beaver habitat, but they can make it good beaver habitat again. So they will rebuild. So yes, it doesn't, if their dam gets blown out, it does not necessarily mean that they'll move on.
Right. And then one of our young participants has a great question. Do beavers brush their teeth?
Good question. I do not know if beavers brush their teeth. Maybe that toothbrush truck would be really good for them. I do know that this photo in particular shows the beaver grooming itself. So they do spend a lot of time grooming, but I don't think specifically they groom their teeth. Since they spend so much time in water, they have to make sure that they stay warm. So they'll groom themselves to make sure that their fur is still functioning really well. And they do have a special toenail that helps them groom better. It's kind of a double toenail, like their toe can be a good hairbrush.
Oh, that's great. And another question, how long does it take to build a dam?
Oh, great question. So that can vary a lot, right? If you think about the variety of streams and rivers that we have, if you have just a little trickle of water, a beaver can throw a couple sticks in and block that up really easily and nicely. If we have a bigger river system, it's going to take a lot of work to build that big dam. But typically what I've seen is a lot of folks who are experiencing problems with beavers will remove a beaver dam in hopes of keeping the water flowing. And beavers can come back in a night and rebuild a dam that's, of a moderate size. So they can be very quick at building dams, certainly, depending on the size of the waterway that they're building them in.
Great. I think we don't have any more questions at this point, but feel free to type in more questions on this subject and we can get to those later on.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll move on to beaver benefits. Again, feel free to throw those questions in the chat. We'll keep them coming. Okay, so one of the big distinctions between beavers and all these other critters that I shared with you is that they have a really huge impact. Not only are they huge, but they have a huge impact on the ecosystems that they live in. Because they are doing these dam building activities and because it's changing the habitat that they're living in, that has huge implications and lots of benefits. So we like to call beavers ecosystem engineers. If you imagine just a straight flowing stream and then beavers start building all these dams, like outlined by these white lines here, they're really changing the whole environment that they're living in. They're engineering that whole ecosystem to be something new and different. So this is the key aspect of why beavers are so important and why we at Snohomish Conservation District have a whole program for living with beavers, because we see that there are all these benefits. One of those benefits is that beavers build aquatic habitat. So if you think about, again, just a straight stream just flowing in its own way, that has a certain value to our ecosystem and our habitat. But if you change that and make it more complex by building beaver dams, having fallen logs, having these standing snag trees, you really change the amount of wildlife that can thrive there and build better habitat. So for instance, like these snags that are left behind as beavers flood out an area are really great for cavity nesting birds like woodpeckers. This ponded area that beavers create is really great for waterfowl like ducks. You have this new habitat for birds like herons who like to fish. great habitat for amphibians and other animals that need that wet area, and especially amphibians lay eggs in these wet ponds. And then, of course, other mammals like our river otters who really like this kind of messy, wet habitat. And bugs really love beaver ponds as well, invertebrates, right? There's a lot of bugs living in the water. So expanding that out is great. Thinking about dragonflies who need that slow moving water to lay their eggs. And then, of course, last but not least is fish. These beaver ponds can be really beneficial to fish, especially juvenile salmonids. So if you think about our salmon that run through these streams that are so important culturally and economically, and just an amazing part of living in the Pacific Northwest, those salmon, the baby salmon, spend some time in the streams, and especially coho can spend up to a year in freshwater streams, and they need places to hide, they need bugs to eat for food, they need all of this stuff that is provided in a beaver pond. So lots of great aquatic habitat being maintained and built by beavers. A question that I get a lot about beavers and beaver dams is, what about fish passage, right? As we're talking about salmon who need to make their way upstream, it's this incredible journey that they're coming from the sea and swimming upstream in the fresh water. We want to make sure that they can get where they want to be to these really good habitats. And one of the great things about beaver dams and beaver ponds is, as I mentioned, they are very beneficial to fish and especially salmon. And they're a natural part of our ecosystems, right? Beavers have been here for tens of thousands of years, and so have salmon, and they have thrived together. So the important thing to remember about this is that our salmon can jump. They're really good at jumping. They're really good at battering their way through these kind of minimal areas that are a blockage or in a stream. So salmon can jump over beaver dams that are of a certain height. Oftentimes beaver dams are built at a certain height, and then in the fall, as we start getting more rains, water is flowing over the dams or around the dams, and that's where fish can move over and around the dams and follow those kind of alternate pathways as we get those rain events. Similarly, beaver dams are not perfect, right? If you think about a human-built dam, it's this huge wall of concrete. There's nothing getting through, no water at all. But beaver dams are built out of mud and sticks, so they tend to trickle. There's little pockets of water flowing through them, over around them. And so juvenile fish have this ability to kind of wiggle through those spaces or fall over a beaver dam as flow overtops it when we get a rain event. So there is this opportunity for fish to move over and around beaver dams. That being said, there's a lot of places where we as people have changed stream systems. We've made them straight or narrow or put them in a concrete chute. And then if a beaver builds a dam, there's not really as much opportunity for flow over and around. So those can be scenarios where a beaver dam might be an issue to fish, but it's also partially a people issue, right? The way that we change the ecosystem made it inopportune for beavers to change the ecosystem in the way they normally do. Okay, so another benefit of beavers is that they improve water quantity. So there's a photo on the bottom left of a beaver area with that lodge in the background. And then this photo, this kind of comic on the right, is a great depiction of how the water behind beaver dams interacts with the rest of the water cycle. So you can think about evaporation happening from beaver ponds. You can think about that water being pushed down into the ground and increasing the groundwater and the availability of water underground. That often will cool as it's underground and then maybe upwell later down in the stream. So that's really beneficial. And they're also just kind of holding on to water and storing it, right? So we get that help with drought issues. We get help with flood storage. When we do get big rain events, there's more area for water to flow and hold in those ponds so it doesn't just all rush downstream at once. So improving water quantity is really important. And then, of course, we also improve water quality. So similar, as I mentioned, we can improve temperature. Salmon really need cool, clear, and cold water. So that cold water, as the water trickles down into the groundwater and then upwells again, that helps to reduce the temperature of these streams. And then beaver ponds are also, often they're creating wetlands and ponded areas, and that's where a lot of nutrients can get taken up. So we have a lot of problems with excess nutrients or pollutants in the water, and these beaver wetlands can help soak that all up especially all the bugs living in there and the plants living in there. So they're improving water quality as well. The last piece of water quality that they also improve is sediment. So you think about erosion happening on streams, and all of that is making the water a little bit dirtier, not as clear for our salmon. So beaver ponds kind of hold on to that water and that water with sediment and allow the sediment to settle out. So we get these clearer patches downstream where we get nice gravel, it's not mucky, and salmon really need that gravel to lay their eggs. So water, we've got beavers building aquatic habitat, improving water quantity and improving water quality. And all of this kind of combines together to create ecosystem resilience, which helps our ecosystems to weather big events, to be stronger, especially as we face challenges like climate change. So you can imagine our streams, looking just kind of briefly at climate change effects on our streams. This is a really simplified graphic, but in our area, what we see is that streams in the winter have higher flow as we're getting all this rainwater. And then in the summer, we're not as much rain. We start that, there's maybe some snow melt happening in the spring, but not as much happening in the summer. So we get these kind of lower conditions, lower stream flow conditions, and then it cycles back through. With climate change, the trends that we're seeing is that we're seeing more and more higher stream flows in the winter. So we're seeing more precipitation fall as rain instead of snow. And then we're also seeing kind of lower stream flows in the summer, leading to more drought conditions, high winter flows leading to more flooding, low summer flows leading to more drought conditions, poorer habitat, etc. So one of the beauties of beavers is that they can help build resilience. So you can imagine if we add beavers into the system, we start to reverse those trends. They're storing more water, right? So in the winter, when we get those big rain events, they hold on to some of that water, and then their imperfect dams allow it to slowly trickle out through the summer, improving the summer stream flow conditions. So beavers can be this really beneficial partner as we're thinking about some of these negative effects of climate change. Resilience, of course. So I just wanted to put another picture in your head. There's a lot of folks getting really excited about the work that beavers do to help restore ecosystems. So this is a photo from some folks doing Beaver Dam Analogs, which are a new technology to kind of mimic the way that beavers are improving ecosystems. So this is kind of early conditions of a stream. You can imagine a lot of the impacts that have happened since settlers colonized this area is that streams have been straightened. They tend to just flow really quickly down a chute, and they start to incise, which means they get deeper and deeper and deeper with higher, steeper banks. So beaver dams can be really beneficial to changing this, right? As you start getting beaver dams in there, they're widening the channel. There's some cute little beavers doing their work in here, widening the channel, and then creating this really complex, intense, very different ecosystem that's really beneficial for all these reasons that we just talked about. So thinking about an incised stream being that kind of narrow, deep channel to a restored stream, which is a little flatter, allows for more water storage on the floodplains and the areas outside of that stream channel. So I'm going to leave this one up here as we go to questions about beaver benefits. So happy to answer any more questions you have about beaver benefits or generally beavers. And then we'll move into our last section about beaver management.
Okay, no questions yet. See if anything comes in.
Everybody's just so excited about beaver benefits. They all made perfect sense. I love that.
Yeah. This is a nice addition about the Beaver Dam Analogs. Very cool.
Yeah, it's a really interesting new technology we're seeing more about.
Yeah. Here's a question. Are otters a danger to baby beavers?
That's a great question. I have not heard any confirmed reports of that being so, but I imagine they could be. So river otters are predators, and they do tend to eat small things. So I do think, baby beavers could be susceptible to otter predation for sure. Beavers are very big themselves, so an adult beaver is not susceptible to much. except for maybe wolves or bears or, maybe cougars, like these really big predators. But those baby beavers are really susceptible to predation from all kinds of critters, including, birds of prey and coyotes and probably river otters. But no confirmed that I know of instances of that happening. But, we don't often catch those predator-prey relationships very easily.
I'm not seeing any other questions at this point.
Great. I'll just keep moving then. We'll run into beaver management. Okay, so, beavers have all these benefits. We're all on board. We love that. They're doing their thing as these big rodents, engineering ecosystems. But of course, that inherently comes into conflict with us as engineers, also people. So we tend to build a lot of roads, homes, other infrastructure along waterways in these areas that perhaps historically were occupied by beavers. But, beavers were severely trapped out in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So their population is much lower than it historically was. So as beavers are kind of coming back, they're thriving. We're seeing more and more conflicts with beavers as well. So we're going to run through kind of the 3 big ticket types of beaver conflicts. These are the things that folks most often call us concerned about. So one is tree chew. As I mentioned, beavers are voracious and will chew a lot of trees. They'll eat some of them, but also they'll just use them to build their dams or chew down trees that they just don't want in their area. And then that can be an issue, right? If you've got precious fruit trees or really big trees or a limited number of trees along your waterway, beavers chewing them down can be an issue. We've also got culvert blockage and general flooding. So I'm going to dive into all of these as we go and talk about solutions, because luckily there are solutions to every single one of these beaver problems. One of the first solutions for any beaver problem is beaver trapping and or relocation. So trapping beavers lethally is legal in Washington. There's still folks that do it for fur, do it recreationally, and folks that do it as a conflict management tool. So beaver trapping is something that can happen, and beaver relocation is something that is kind of new in our area, but is really starting to thrive. So there are folks that do relocation regularly, and we most often partner with the Tulalip tribes. They have a great program to relocate beavers, and they take problem beavers from our lowland areas, urban, rural, suburban, and then move them up into the upper watersheds and the Cascades, onto Forest Service land, where there's less potential for conflict and only benefits that beavers can provide and restore that habitat. So beaver trapping lethally or live trapping for relocation are both strategies that can be utilized, but they're both temporary. So I think of relocation as this really great restoration strategy, right? We can take those benefits of beavers and put them somewhere else where beavers aren't right now. But it's temporary because if you have an area that is really good beaver habitat that beavers like to build, that has good food availability, there are constantly new beavers dispersing, right? We talked about those 2-year-olds leaving mom and dad's lodge to go find their own, and they're dispersing, they're finding new habitat. If you've got really good habitat, you've got beautiful willows planted there, and it just looks really prime for a beaver, someone else will find it, right? So thinking about removing beavers as a temporary solution to beaver problems. Tree chew, as I mentioned, really common issue that we see. Beavers are choosy. They like willows and cottonwoods, but they also really like fruit trees. I've seen a lot of chew on fruit trees, and they'll tend to sometimes chew those really big, precious, giant cottonwoods, or other giant tree species that you just love. So tree chew can be a concern for some folks. But luckily there's a pretty simple solution, which is just wrapping those trees. So this is 2 different examples. The one on the left is a restoration project we did on a property. So we wrapped some of those trees that are young, to give them a chance to grow big and strong. so that the beavers can't just mow them all down in one go. And then you can also wrap larger trees. So the photo on the right is two big maples. Maples are another one that beavers love, that we wrapped to protect those trees from the beavers. So beavers are, as I said, very big. So it's important to make sure that this fencing is tall enough to prevent beavers from chewing the trees. We recommend at least 3-foot fencing, 4-foot, even better. We typically use welded wire fencing. You can buy it in rolls at most farm supply or garden stores, and roll it out around the trees. You'll notice that these use little wooden stakes to help keep the fencing in place. It's important that it goes all the way to the ground so that beavers can't just wedge their way underneath the fencing. And then we also install it away from the tree trunk itself, especially on those big trees. It's important to make sure that tree has room to grow. So giving it a little bit of room, if you wrap it right tight up against the tree, you're gonna have to keep moving it out as that tree grows so that it doesn't damage the tree itself. And right tight up against the tree means that beavers might be able to still get their little teeth in there between the fencing and chew on it. I typically send folks away from using chicken wire, wrapping chicken wire around a tree. The chicken wire is just not quite strong enough, and those beaver teeth are really strong, and we've seen them chew through chicken wire. So using that kind of heavier duty fencing, that welded wire fencing is much better. Okay, another type of conflict that we see often is culvert blockage. So, culverts typically go under roadways and are kind of this area where your big stream comes down to a smaller pipe. It's a constriction of flow, especially if it's in a roadbed. Beavers really just see it as this perfect, easy spot to build where they can have a huge impact. By blocking a small area, they get a lot of water backed up. So culverts are tough. This photo on the top is of a really large culvert. So luckily here in Washington, we're seeing more and more culverts be upgraded to improve fish passage, improve wildlife habitat. But unfortunately, that doesn't prevent beavers from blocking them, because this is still a spot where, beavers can build. So you'll see that little dam just right there inside that culvert. But we do have a solution. So culverts can be protected using exclusion fencing. This is a really specific way of building fencing to keep beavers away from the culvert. So you'll see the culvert here under this roadway, and the fencing is a trapezoidal shape, and typically we send them out at least 15 to 16 feet from the culvert. And so that trapezoid, we're preventing beavers from getting close, but it also sometimes can trick them. So these are sometimes referred to as beaver deceivers, because they will still feel and hear that water flowing through the culvert. So they might build along the fence right up next to the culvert, but they typically don't build all the way around because we've created such a large perimeter that's hard to build around. So water will still flow through the front, maybe through the sides here, but might get a little blocked up right in here. But that's fine because we've still got water flowing through the culvert. It's not blocked, and we're not backing up water in that way. So these typically work really well in areas where there's somewhere else for the beaver to build. If you don't have another spot to build and they're building on the culvert and there's nowhere else that they could go where it wouldn't cause a problem, then this exclusion fence is not such a good idea, because this is really meant to just keep them away from there and encourage them to go somewhere else, but probably close by. So these are really great. The other thing to mention here is that in order to make sure that these are still passable for fish and other small wildlife, we use pretty big fencing. We use cattle panel fencing that has 6-inch by 8-inch mesh. So that means even those big spawning salmon returning upstream can fit through this fencing. It does require maintenance, and it does require a permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we'll talk about that more. The last type of beaver conflict that we see a lot and most often is general flooding. Beavers, their main goal is to flood an area and create a bigger pond or wetland for themselves. But if you have a home or a road or an agricultural field that is adjacent to a stream, then that flooding can be detrimental. So the solution that we typically recommend for general flooding is called a pond leveler. And these are a pretty simple construction of just a pipe through the beaver dam. So I've got kind of an engineering drawing down below, and this is a photo of one that we installed. So the pipe goes through the beaver dam at a height that we determine. And then the inlet of the pipe is blocked by a cage so that beavers cannot get close to that pipe and feel the water and block it up just like they do with a culvert. And so very simple devices, but the idea here is that we compromise. We find a compromise between the needs of the beaver and the needs of the people. So if you're experiencing flooding of your home or road or your yard, then we can install a pond leveler to reduce that flooding. But the main goal here again is that the beavers are allowed to stay. So we don't just bring this back down to staying inside the stream channel. We still want some pond or wetland, but we just want to reduce that height so that it doesn't impact your property as much as before. So this doesn't mean that we're getting rid of the beavers, doesn't mean we're getting rid of that new great habitat that they've created. We're just kind of putting boundaries on how far they can extend that flooding. So these are really awesome devices that I love to install. And I just think they're such a neat little way of getting around some of those concerns around beaver impacts. So again, here's those solutions. We've got tree chew, can be fixed with tree wrapping, culvert blockage with exclusion fencing, and then general flooding with pond levelers. And these are all things that the Snohomish Conservation District can assist with. So these are things that I do on a daily basis and help folks figure out and install. So some things that we can do at the Snohomish Conservation District is we'll come out and do site visits for folks living, again, in Snohomish County or Camino Island. And we'll walk through kind of some of the possibilities. We'll talk about what's going on, what are your concerns, and what solutions can we implement here, what's realistic. We can also assist with permitting. As I mentioned briefly, any work in water requires a permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So installing an exclusion fence like me down here or a pond leveler, those both require permits from the Department of Fish and Wildlife to show that you are not going to be negatively impacting fish species. Similarly, if you just have a beaver dam that's causing you problems and you want to notch it or remove it, that also requires a permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we can assist with getting these permits, walking you through the process on how to get these permits, giving you ideas of best practices for installing these devices or helping you install them ourselves. We do also provide financial assistance with materials for these devices and installation. So, I can come out on site and help install it. We can help get the materials for folks living in certain areas. So we do have grants that are specific to certain watersheds and areas. So certainly reach out, and we have lots of money available in some places, and I'm happy to help folks walk through this whole process. And then, of course, there's so much more that the Conservation District does. So as Kathryn mentioned in her entrance slides, we do a lot of technical assistance around a lot of topics. So if you have other questions about natural resources or farming or anything on your property, give us a call. Certainly we can point you in the direction of the expert on our staff who can give you that technical advice. I just wanted to share a few more resources. We do have a Better Ground fact sheet on beavers, which I think was included in the course materials for this class, so you might have been able to download that, and it will certainly be available after the class as well, or you can reach out if you want it. Just a quick one-sheet idea of beavers and why they're important, so kind of a summary of this whole talk. There's also a great page on the Department of Fish and Wildlife website called Living with Wildlife. There's a beaver page. They have several pages, and once again, a kind of longer summary of what we've just talked about. And then last but not least, if you're really now a beaver believer and you're all in and you want to learn everything there is, there's the Beaver Restoration Guidebook from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is a really long document with lots of great information about beaver ecology and strategies for working with and planning for beavers. So that's a really great resource with lots of good expertise in there. Okay, and I just want to open it up for questions. We're done with our kind of formal talk. My contact information is here on this slide again, my phone number and my email. I do work part-time at the district, so it may take me a day or two to get back to you, but trust me, I will get back to you as soon as possible. So happy to answer any other questions.
We've got a couple of questions. One is about dam notching. Somebody's heard about that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so dam notching is, again, kind of I would call it a temporary strategy, similar to relocation. Dam notching is where if you have a beaver dam that's causing some flooding concerns, you can go out and remove some material. Typically, notching means you're not removing the entire dam. You're just removing a small amount of material from a portion of the dam. And that allows a release of some water. So when we install those pond levelers, we do notch the dam, pull back some material to install that pipe, but you can just notch a dam without installing a pipe and allow water to flow. And that can help reduce flooding, but it's temporary, right? So as I mentioned early on, I've seen a lot of folks notching dams or removing dams, and then beavers come back overnight and rebuild that dam. So typically a notch, if it's a dam that beavers are actively maintaining, it might last for 1 day up to a week, but not much longer than that. So a notch is, again, temporary solution, but something you can do to alleviate some of that flooding in a short-term manner. I have seen folks that, just it's part of their regular rotation on their farm that they go out and notch the beaver dam every morning or every couple days, and that is their solution to beaver flooding issues. So a pond leveler is meant to reduce the need for that continued notching maintenance. And once again, notching does still require a permit from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So just notching a dam doesn't get you away from getting that permit, but happy to help folks walk through that process.
And who are the main predators of beavers?
Yeah, so adult beavers, as I mentioned, are big, and so they don't have a lot of predators. In our more rural or wild environments, they could be eaten by bears or wolves or potentially even coyotes, but that's a big stretch because it's a pretty big prey for a coyote. There is a really neat group studying wolves in Voyageurs National Park, and there's a Voyageurs National Park Wolf Project, and they've done a lot of research on wolves that do eat beavers and preferentially choose to eat beavers during certain times of the year. So that's been a really interesting, I find that study very interesting, and seeing the results that come out of that, seeing beavers being eaten by wolves and the kind of the strategies there for getting a beaver when it's out of the water. And then, as I mentioned too, the kits are much more susceptible to being eaten by a wider swath of predators. So potentially big birds, other smaller mammals like coyotes or potentially even river otters.
All right. And what is their lifespan?
Typically, beavers will live to be about 10 to 15 years old, but some areas, because beavers are familial and live in these colonies, sometimes you'll have an area that is continuously occupied by a beaver family for a really long time, upwards of 100 years that beavers are living in the same spot because, maybe mom or dad passes away, but one of the kids takes over the beaver family farm. So they only live about 10 to 15 years, but that doesn't necessarily mean your beavers will be gone in 10 to 15 years if you have them around a spot.
All right. Any other questions? All right. I am not seeing any more questions at this point.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. And again, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email if you have other questions. And I appreciate everybody tuning in today.
All right. Thank you very much. I will pause recording and